distractions. Maybe it's rambling, maybe it's just madness, thoughts in the wind. Do you have intrusive thoughts? Hell, all my thoughts are intrusive. Yes, of course. The anarchy. Hey, maybe I'm a little bit mad, but maybe I see the world from a different perspective. Take it apart and put it back together to see how it works and go down some very big rabbit holes. Taking the red pill, we're always deconstructing everything, unlearning it, right? To understand something, you have to sort of step outside of it and observe it. We create models for the world in our brains. Words are never accurate enough to describe that you don't know anything. So he wanted his interpretation to be the interpretation. How the world is kind of being nudged. Everything's a commercial. You can go to YouTube and look up how did somebody do it. And we kind of defer to authority. People don't want to be responsible for their own actions. The only way to make sense of this world is to accept that it's partially madness and chaos.
Welcome.
I suppose I jump into this. I wanted to discuss the nature of knowing, of knowing anything. What is knowledge? What is knowing? What does it mean to know? As I stumble through this, how do you know and this and that, I think I am sort of paralyzed in that you don't know anything. It paralyzes me sometimes because even trying to make this video, I thought it over. I had so many notes running around in my head. I thought about it in my head and got it right where I wanted it, and I can never replicate it. I can never say it exactly how I thought it. Words are never accurate enough to describe. And even making this video, I'll stumble going through the edits. What should I keep? What should I not? Oh, should I add a part? Oh, I could put a part in right here. Just get it done. I mean, I know these thoughts are all jumping around. I'm trying to pull in all these intersecting ideas and to try to paint this big picture. But I can never get it just right. I can never... In my mind, it seems to make sense and it seems to all piece together these big ideas that I can't fully grasp, but they are useful, practical models for the world. But that word practical is, again, a key, is to kind of take it for what it is, accept that you don't know, accept that you don't know everything, and try to just forge forward with on a practical path. And of course, words are so imperfect. It's really difficult to try to dig at deep philosophical ideas or paint these giant abstract models of the world to understand, to know, or to even project the idea of knowing is really, really difficult. Words are so far from perfect. The French phrase je ne sais quoi is I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm not French, obviously, but it kind of is like the expression that it is the quality of something that's hard to put into words, right? So it's elusive to words, right? That's what the saying means. I think the English word would be ineffable, right? It is beyond description, that it can't be described. It is like a feeling, or it is indefinable, elusive to words, right? And I think a lot of these ideas are, but I'm hoping that I can scrape the surface and paint a picture that is worthy of observing. Sometimes I definitely find myself paralyzed by so much information coming in and overthinking things. And, I'm constantly trying to take notes as I'm thinking. My mind is always racing. I'm taking down notes of, oh, this is a good thought, and how can I include this in a video? And and trying to be the record keeper, so to speak, trying to file away each thing, trying to make it into some type of perfect system, some type of perfect process, with writing, with doing a video like this. And you sort of come to a point where you realize that it's like impossible to have it all perfectly filed away and perfectly orderly and, a perfect process. And, in physics, information is neither created nor destroyed. But it feels like I'm just losing information constantly. So much information, and I can only grasp a little fraction of it and file it away and frame it just right in order to project an idea. And but you're barely just scraping the surface. And it feels like so much information is just being destroyed, is being lost. I've heard the term before, the amnesia generation, because we live in so much information that we think that, everything, it's everywhere, but there's so much of it being lost. So much of it is being just disappearing into the nothing. When, you work in manufacturing, or you're like fixing things, or you're doing something around the house or something, you kind of realize that there is no perfect, right? Like, you can never do something perfectly. So as you're trying to patch up something, you're trying to get it just right, and there is no such thing as just right. It's not even possible. So you're trying to attain something. It's a goal. It's your target, but you can never actually hit that target. And I think that's sometimes paralyzing to me, that you can break this down a whole bunch of different ways. You try to think this cigar, it said was 5.5 inches long, right? And that's an abstraction. 5.5 inches is an abstraction. There is no such thing as exactly 5.5. How many significant digits do you go to say exactly how long the cigar is? You can always go one more significant digit, right? So it's general, right? In engineering terms, you would talk about it as it's 5.5 inches, and then you'd state the quality of your manufacturing process, which would be the tolerance on it, plus or minus, I don't know, 1/10 of an inch maybe for cigars. Who knows? I don't know what the actual tolerance is for cigars, but it's generally in that range, and then it's when you go to your calibration equipment that's going to measure it, that has to be to a significant digit further to be able to even measure this one, right? So that has to be accurate beyond what it's measuring. Of course, philosophy, you want to go philosophy, you got to go to the ancient Greeks, and back in the time of Plato, Zeno, right, was this guy. He was notorious for perplexing the philosophers of the day, because he had these paradoxes, right? And he would say if this guy was running to Olympus or something, right, or if he was going to, I don't know, somewhere, right, that he would at some point he would go halfway, right, and then from there to his destination, he would go halfway. And then from there to his destination, he would always be going half and half and half, right? And always cutting it there. And then he'd never got there. Right? So it's kind of like the paradoxes of you cut something in half. How small can it actually get? How you can't get to zero if you keep cutting something in half. So it's one of these paradoxes. It's infinity in a ratio type form, right? So infinity we know is an abstraction. But even just numbers are just abstractions. They don't exist in nature. Even if you think of, you have 5 apples, all of those apples are different, right? They're non-fungible technically. We think of them as fungible so that they're practical, but each one is different. They're all separate. So I think it just kind of brings up interesting notions of trying to get something and be practical about just what you're doing, just things in general, doing anything to be practical. Either way, you got maps are like models of how you see the world, right? You know, you're driving down the road and it's like the lines are like straight, and it's like they're not perfectly straight. Like there's no such thing as perfectly straight. And like, how do you do something practically? Like just get it done. And sometimes that definitely like it gets in my way of like how good does it need to be, and like what is practical. But I think that's why, you know, we always we kind of defer to authority. You defer to somebody else that's done it before, or you use something else as a model to like as an example to model after. You know, of course, what do you do when you want to get something done? You go to YouTube and like look up how did somebody do it. You know, let somebody else tell you, and then you kind of stumble your way through it. And I think that kind of builds into, you know, these abstractions that we build up in our head, these models. You know, we kind of analyze them from outside to try to observe your model and try to understand it and maybe take it apart and put it back together to see how it works and this and that. You're a part of it. You're in it. It's some of it's learned behavior, and you're doing it. And to step outside and observe it from outside, you have to kind of unlearn it and observe it. You know, Descartes obviously struggled with this a little bit, the depths of solipsism. But he has this saying that I think most people know him from is, I think, therefore I am. But I believe he said, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. And I mean, his argument is that his merely doubting his own existence is a paradox. Because if he can doubt, then he is thinking, therefore he is. So that's where it's kind of an interesting conundrum. But doubting, right, there's connotations with doubt, is to dissent, to be different, to not go along with authority, to not conform. And I think the doubting is a pretty key part, because it's kind of that contrariness, the doubting, the dissenting, right, to even question that you are, is kind of, it's really important, because I think you could think of it as the default is nothingness, not existing. And to be contrary against the default is somethingness. And to like realize that he definitely existed, he had to doubt his own existence. To go down that rabbit hole, to even question his existence, was necessary to prove his existence. So the contrariness, the differentness, the dissenter is really an important role in science, in technology, in philosophy, in the world, in just being a human, I guess. You know, it's the ultimate battle against entropy. You know, information being controlled or destroyed. We're constantly battling entropy, the chaos. You know, the chaos that is existence. And I think when it comes to statistics, I mean, our world is a big statistic machine at this point. We you know, everything in the medical field, all this stuff is all statistics. How do you know something? And it's kind of, I think the way I model statistics and like determinism is really trying to find causation and, you know, inferring and piecing together action and reaction. But I think the statistical world is extremely useful, and it can be practical, but it can be wrong. It's not infallible. I seem to model the statistical world of if we're trying to determine causation, that oftentimes we're drawing all these correlations, and then we're trying to make the assumption that there's causation there. And it's kind of like when we don't fully understand a system. If we fully understood how a system worked, then we could deterministically figure out what's happening and what would happen in the system. But if we don't know all the variables and we don't know exactly how the system works, we have all these variables. We might not catch all of them, but we might catch enough of them with this big net that we catch enough of them and we can sufficiently describe the system with statistics. And I think it's a more practical approach than trying to understand every nook and cranny of a system. But I think, of course, that can lead to misconceptions, of course. If you have a die, right, a die, and you roll it, we use this analogy often in statistics that 1/6 of the time it'll land on each number, right? Because the die is equal on all sides and it's not weighted. It's perfect, right? Which there's nothing that's perfect, so it's going to be skewed always. But we like to think of it statistically because you don't know what number it's going to land on. But if you knew exactly, its starting position, the amount of force that it was thrown at, the angle of attack, the distance to the target, the friction of the table, the weight of the die, all these things. If you knew every single variable, then you could predict what number it's going to land on, right? In a deterministic method. Because we can't predict what number it's going to land on with a statistical method, not on a single roll. We can say the chances of it landing on a particular number, but we don't know what number it's going to land on. So if you use the statistics for a single roll, it's going to be essentially useless. But on a large time scale, or many instances, if you do it 100 times, you can better describe it using a statistical method, because now the angle of attack, the force that you're throwing it at, all these things sort of drowns out between the rolls of the die. It's a wash. And now you can better predict what the outcomes are. But we like to use the die as random, but in numbers theory, in encryption and practical applications, there's no real such thing as random. We can make it as complex as possible so that it seems random, but it's not truly random. In a practical sense, it's random, but it's not perfectly random. I think Einstein said that God doesn't play dice, when we talk about statistics and all these things. But the universe is the master record keeper. The information isn't being destroyed. It's all there. It's just we have trouble putting it perfectly orderly and setting the record straight. So, important aspects of what you're going to do and what you know, or what you know, often depends on your initial mindset going into a circumstance, right? It's your bias. It's your initial state determines what your progress through the next state is going to be. And so, it's kind of an interesting example is that, there's lots of people in a postmodern world, right, that will look at many things as systemic racism. Does this systemic racism exist? Of course. From like evolutionary biology, of course, racism has proliferated, right? There's no doubt about it, but it's really difficult to put your finger on exactly where it's occurring and how it's occurring. And there's many people that will look at the system as being biased, right? Systemic racism. And I think what's happening often in society now, though, is that so many people have heard that just drilled into their brains so many times that they're constantly looking for it everywhere, and they're constantly using that as their explanation. That's their bias, right? That they're saying that the system is biased as systemic racism, but that's their bias. Their bias is constantly looking for that and calling everything that. So the pendulum has sort of swung in that direction, that now that's the bias that all these people are blind to because they're saying that the system's biased. Well, la-di-da, full circle, right? So it's definitely interesting, you know, when you're trying to pursue your enemy, you know, sometimes you end up looking in the mirror. And I think, you know, that's partly what taking the red pill is, right? Is you sort of see how the world is kind of being nudged, and a lot of people just kind of going about their daily stuff, because when you get to these, you don't know exactly, and there is no such thing as knowing, and some of these things that it is paralyzing, right? I think a lot of people are paralyzed by that notion, and that's kind of where you get the crossroads of authority and freedom. I think our culture in general, from a high level, I think is undergoing a pretty big shift right now. It's kind of going from this kind of trust that, you know, your government and your, you know, the big system, you know, the corporations and all these big interests, these big, you know, entities that rule the world, that they're all well-meaning and that they will figure things out, and they'll lead the way, they'll light the path, and they'll right themselves and some of this stuff. And I think that's where we're kind of finding out that, like, they won't. Like, they're just acting on their best knowledge. They don't have all the answers. And while some of it is good intentioned, there's consequences to every action. So I think, you know, I don't think that there's lots of ill-meaning entities in the world, but I think that, I mean, there is, but at the same time, I think that a lot of the goodness in the world and people that are trying to do good, I think there's lots of ways for it to go wrong and for the model to not match up for what the intention is. And so I think, you know, where we've come from, though, right, the pendulum kind of swings both ways, right, between like authoritarianism and then kind of like, you know, freedom-oriented, individualistic thinking, where it's kind of like when things aren't going right, you got to kind of take it in your own hands, and you got to, you know, right the ship and forge your own path. And I think we're coming from a period of, I think there was a lot of trust in kind of higher up authorities, right, in science. And I think, of course, the pandemic made things a little tricky to navigate, and there's lots of, you know, it showed that, you know, we weren't infallible. We were like, trusted, our science is so advanced and we can conquer anything, and it was kind of like we got slapped in the face to be kind of brought back down to earth to, we are still just earth dwelling beings, we're not gods. And the authority, the top-down kind of nature of authority is being kind of overturned, where like a lot of these trusted sources and, you know, the media and these big like media moguls and all this stuff, I think is just, it's crumbling underneath the decentralized kind of
ecosystem.
You know, it's kind of it is really now like influencers, right? We kept hearing that all during the election, the influencers. And that's kind of like, you know, going to the ground level of, you know, these people just sitting in a, you know, cave like me talking. And it's like, those people are like authorities to some extent, but I don't know, are they? Especially when they're being paid to say things. It's kind of absurd, you know, it's just commercials. You like forget that you're watching a video and there's commercials, it pauses and you watch your commercial. Well, it doesn't always do that anymore. Everything's a commercial. Everything's a commercial. Even this. Buy this cigar. I'm just kidding. I'm joking, you two. You can't even joke anymore. I mean, come on. What have we come to? But I think it's interesting. You can see these other times in history where, the pendulum has swung different ways, right? We're in a decentralizing phase right now of media and information, the ecosystem. And, I think we saw that back when the printing press was released, right? You saw that in like the King James Bible, right? It's called the King James Bible, right? King James he thought, he kind of wanted to seize power in a way. It's subtle, but to seize power by interpreting the book his way and how he saw things should be fit, because he thought that a lot of the priests were interpreting it their way, and that gave them power. They were the ones telling the people. So he wanted his interpretation to be the interpretation, the way. And, it's interesting because you look back and I always wondered this too. It's like, what is the significance of Don Quixote? I never understood why that book was so important or amazing. And it's like, the content in like the story is interesting, but the real like significance of that book was one of the first texts to be put in, to be like widely spread and published, and it was in Castilian Spanish, and that kind of set the tone to be like the main language. If everyone was to read that, right, to be able to read that book, you heard of that book, someone told you the story, if you wanted to read it yourself, you needed to learn that dialect. And you see during the Protestant Reformation, right, that was kind of a changing of authority from the top down of the the authority figures interpreting the Bible for you and telling you, and you had to interpret it from them. But to have Martin Luther advocated that the people needed to be able to read the Bible and interpret it themselves. And to do that, you needed to be able to read. And so literacy really was boosted by the Protestant Reformation, right? People that wanted to interpret it themselves. They wanted to decide for themselves what it meant, right? And that was a big change in the culture, right? It was a top-down culture where you went and got your news, right? Your information from the priests, right? You were lucky if you had a book in your hut, whatever you lived in back then. But I'm obviously kind of generalizing and brushing over some pretty big ideas that could go down some very big rabbit holes. But they touch on this idea of the changing of a culture, from a centralized, like top-down authority to more of a bottom-up, individualistic society. And some of that is just through the revolution of how information is spread, how it's being. And AI is going to be another one of these ones where it's going to like flip back maybe to be centralized again. And I think it's centralized in different ways, right? I mean, this is being distributed through a big conglomerate entity, right? But I think it's interesting in a authoritarian, top-down type society. It's interesting, and maybe this is just always. I don't know. It's always been this way, or that. Dissidents, people that think differently, are outcast, as dissenters, the contrary child, disruptors. That's like the business world, like, loves disruptors, but then when it comes to like politics and stuff like that, nobody likes dissent. So it's like a weird mix of all this stuff. But, I think people that are different, they think differently, they are different. Society treats them as outcasts. And I think a lot of it is because the authoritarian, powers that be try to kind of control, and somebody that thinks outside the box can't always be controlled if they've got different models for how they see the world or how they think of the world or how things should be. But you think, of the Protestant Reformation, to think, authority author, right? He who writes is kind of at the helm, who's in control, is subtly swaying your thoughts, how it is written. And it's interesting, Protestant, to be protest to that, to be interpreted for yourself. But I think in a top-down system that, I think a lot of the reason that things go a little strangely is that authority is kind of a weird two-edged or two-way street where you kind of outsource your actions. If you've got to take on things and decide yourself and take the reins yourself, that you got to be responsible, and you live or die by what you do or whatever. Whereas if things are coming from authority, the authority figure is sort of outsourcing the action. So he might know that there might be bad things coming with his actions. Good, there's good, and then there's some bad that comes with whatever actions he has. He's outsourcing it, right? So he he or she will take credit for the good, but outsource the bad. It is what it is. That's But it's interesting how the people doing the action are also outsourcing the responsibility to be like, I'm just doing my job. I'm just doing my job here. I have no moral authority over my actions. It's a two-way outsourced street, and that's where I think building these big conglomerate entities, becomes so convoluted and can go off the tracks, and bad things can happen. Where from a bottom-up type society, I think people are scared of the chaos and of the anarchy that seems like that would come from it, and that's where people are a little. People don't want to be responsible for their own actions, But when you're trying to model the world, you have to come to some type of happy middle ground and just be practical, right? At some point, you got to be practical, even though you can't know and be perfectly certain of something. You got to be practical, and it's kind of like if you spend all your time studying a map, you'll never get to your destination, right? And that's kind of an odd contradiction between trying to make perfect sense of this world, and the only way to make sense of this world is to accept that it's partially madness and chaos. But, maybe these are all just my crazy thoughts. And, they say like, do you have intrusive thoughts? And it's like, hell, all my thoughts are intrusive. Yes, of course. Yeah. But yeah, I've always been a contrary child, so there's good and bad that comes with that. But embrace your being different sometimes, for those people that you think differently and the world shuns you, embrace your differences. Well, if you made it this far, thank you. If you got some comments, random thoughts, intrusive thoughts, drop them in the comments. They're very big picture things. I'm always trying to tie together everything, and so trying to make these big models of the world, and I'm trying to explain them the best I can, and words are never accurate enough to describe, but do your best. Be practical.